History remembers Napoleon for the rivals he conquered. But what if the man he later claimed made me miss my destiny wasn't a famous general or an emperor, but a British naval officer whose name has been all but lost to time? This is the story of Sir Sidney Smith, the man who became one of Napoleon's most vexing unsung nemeses. History is written by the victors. Its grand narrative often focuses on titanic clashes between empires and their famous champions. In the age of Napoleon Bonaparte, these rivals were giants. The Duke of Wellington, the field marshal who would face him at Waterloo. Tsar Alexander I, the emperor of the vast frozen empire that would bleed Napoleon's Grande Armée white. And Admiral Horatio Nelson, the naval genius who shattered French sea power. Their names are forever linked to the story of Napoleon's rise and fall. But history isn't just about the main stage. It's also found in the shadows, in the footnotes, and in the quiet frustrations of great men. Napoleon Bonaparte, a man who redrew the map of Europe and faced down ancient monarchies, harbored a special animosity for someone most of us have never heard of. This wasn't an emperor or a celebrated duke. He was a British naval captain, a swashbuckling commando whose brilliance was matched only by his talent for annoying powerful people, both French and British. This is the story of a rivalry that wasn't fought on the grandest battlefields, but at some of the most critical turning points of Napoleon's career. It's the story of a man who, on two separate occasions, stood squarely in the way of Napoleon's ambition, puncturing his aura of invincibility and altering the course of his life. Chapter 1. The Corsican Comet. To understand the scale of this personal drama, we first need to appreciate the force of nature that was Napoleon Bonaparte in the 1790s. He wasn't yet emperor. He was a product of revolution, a young man of ferocious ambition and supernatural talent, shooting like a comet through the chaotic skies of post-revolutionary France. Born to minor nobility on the island of Corsica, he was an outsider, his accent a subject of mockery in France's military academies. But this driven, solitary young man had an intellect and a will to power that would soon consume a continent. The French Revolution had torn down the old order, sent a king to the guillotine, and plunged the nation into a bloody reign of terror. But it also created a vacuum, an opportunity for men of talent, regardless of birth, to rise on merit. Napoleon's own talent was for war. He was a master of artillery, a student of history's great commanders, and he could read a battlefield, inspire his men, and move his forces with a speed that left his enemies perpetually off balance. By 1793, France was at war with nearly all of Europe. Monarchies looked at the revolution with horror and sought to crush it. France was beset on all sides and torn by civil war. It was in this crucible that the 24-year-old Napoleon found his first real shot at glory. The place was Toulon, France's main naval base on the Mediterranean. Royalist counter-revolutionaries had done the unthinkable. They invited their sworn enemy, the British, into the city. An Anglo-Spanish fleet sailed into the harbor, taking possession of Toulon, and more importantly, the bulk of the French Mediterranean fleet anchored there. For the new French Republic, this was a catastrophe. The loss of Toulon wasn't just a strategic disaster, it was a national humiliation. The Republican army struggled to find a way to dislodge the powerful Royal Navy. It was here that a young, unknown artillery captain named Napoleon Bonaparte stepped forward with a brilliant plan. He argued that the key wasn't the city itself, but the heights overlooking the harbor. From there, his cannons could make the anchorage hell for the British fleet, forcing them to either sail away or be destroyed. His logic was undeniable. He got his command and went to work with relentless efficiency. This was the first act of his legend, the moment the world first heard the name Bonaparte. But as he prepared his cannons, another man whose destiny would become tangled with his own was sailing toward that same harbor. Chapter 2. The Cavalier of the Seas. If Napoleon was a man of cold, calculated ambition, Sir William Sidney Smith was his polar opposite. Born into a military family, Smith seemed like a character from a romance novel. He was flamboyant, charismatic, and impossibly brave, with a love for the theatrical that often grated on his conservative superiors in the Royal Navy. He was a commando-style raider, an expert in daring coastal operations. While Horatio Nelson commanded vast fleets, Smith was the kind of guy who'd lead a few sailors in a small boat to steal an enemy ship from under the guns of a hostile port. His career was a whirlwind of adventure. He fought in the American War of Independence, and when peace left him without a ship, He served as a naval advisor to the King of Sweden against Russia, earning a Swedish knighthood for his trouble. When war with revolutionary France broke out again, he wasn't even officially in the Royal Navy. He was traveling in the Ottoman Empire when he heard the news, and on his own initiative recruited some British seamen and sailed to join the fleet at Toulon, arriving as a volunteer itching for a fight. Smith had an almost pathological need for glory, but it was backed by a real genius for unconventional warfare. He was a master of improvisation and inspired fierce loyalty. To figures like Nelson, Smith was a show-off whose independent actions sometimes stepped on their authority. He was seen as vain and impulsive. But it was this very impulsiveness that made him such a persistent and infuriating thorn in the side of the French. And at Toulon, this Cavalier of the Seas was about to have his first fateful encounter with the calculating Corsican. Chapter 3: The First Clash, the Inferno at Toulon. As 1793 drew to a close, Napoleon's strategy at Toulon proved devastatingly effective. His cannons rained hellfire on the Anglo-Spanish ships. The heights he'd identified were stormed and captured. The Allied position became untenable. The admiral had no choice but to order an evacuation. For Napoleon, it was a triumph, but the battle wasn't over. Inside the harbor lay the prize, a huge portion of the French navy. If recaptured, they would soon sail against Britain. They had to be destroyed. The task was given to the one man who would volunteer for such a mission, Sir Sidney Smith. On the night of December 18, 1793, Smith led a small flotilla of boats into the heart of the enemy harbor. His mission was to turn the French arsenal into a funeral pyre. The docks were swarming with terrified French royalists, begging for passage on the departing ships. Under the cover of darkness, Smith and his men went to work, met by gunfire from Republican soldiers on the shore. He brought in a British fireship, the HMS Vulcan, and positioned it among the French ships of the line. At 10 p.m., the fuses were lit. The result was an apocalypse. The fireship exploded, and flames leaped from ship to ship. On shore, warehouses filled with naval stores erupted in a blazing inferno that lit up the night sky. Napoleon himself, watching from the heights he'd conquered, would later describe the majestic horror of the burning fleet. This was his victory, yet he was forced to watch as this audacious British captain destroyed the prize he had fought to win. Smith's raid wasn't a complete success. The Spanish forces tasked with destroying other ships did their job poorly, and about half the French fleet survived. Nelson would later criticize Smith for this. But the strategic damage was still immense, depriving France of a major naval asset. Toulon made Napoleon a brigadier general, the first step on his path to empire. But the victory was forever tainted by that fiery spectacle. He made a point of finding out who had led the raid. He learned the name, Sir Sidney Smith. It was a name he wouldn't forget. Chapter 4: The Prisoner and the Ghost. The rivalry that began in the fires of Toulon was about to get much more personal. After Toulon, Smith was given his own frigate and waged a highly effective campaign of coastal raiding off the French coast. He became a master of what the French called la chicane, a war of petty, infuriating harassment. In April 1796, his luck ran out. While trying to capture a French vessel from the harbor of Le Havre, the tide turned and he and his men were captured. For the French Republic, this was a propaganda victory. The infamous English firebrand was now their prisoner. Normally, an officer of his rank would be exchanged quickly. But the French Directory, viewing Smith not as an honorable officer but as an arsonist, refused. He was sent to the notorious Temple prison in Paris, the same fortress that had held King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. For 2 years, Smith languished in captivity. From the French perspective, the thorn in their side had been removed. But Sidney Smith wasn't a man to be forgotten. The story of his escape sounds like something out of a novel. With the help of French royalists, a daring plan was hatched. One account claims that his friends forged an official-looking order for his transfer. 2 men dressed as officers presented the flawless forgery at the gates, and the jailers complied. Sir Sidney Smith simply walked out of the front gate. After some cleverly staged confusion in the Paris streets, Smith and a French royalist engineer, Antoine de Philippot, slipped away. They traveled through Normandy, finally reaching the coast, where a small fishing boat carried them into the English Channel to a waiting British frigate. Sir Sidney Smith, the man the French thought they had safely caged, was free. The ghost of Toulon was back. Chapter 5: The Dream of the East. By 1798, General Napoleon Bonaparte was the most powerful man in France. His brilliant campaign in Italy had defeated the Austrians and cemented his reputation as a military genius. His gaze now turned eastward. He envisioned a grand campaign that would rival the deeds of his hero, Alexander the Great. He proposed an invasion of Egypt. The plan was to strike at Britain's interests by controlling overland routes to India. But beneath the strategy lay a deeper, personal ambition, a quest for glory, a chance for Napoleon to cast himself as a new Caesar. The expedition started as a spectacular success. He evaded Nelson's fleet and shattered the power of the Mamluk warriors at the Battle of the Pyramids. But then, disaster struck. At the Battle of the Nile, Admiral Nelson finally found the French fleet and annihilated it. Napoleon's army was now stranded. Since he couldn't go back, he would go forward. He decided to march his army of 13,000 north into Ottoman Syria. His plan was to rally the Syrian population and perhaps even march on Constantinople itself. His advance was swift. He took Gaza and then Jaffa, where his troops massacred thousands of captured Ottoman soldiers in a shocking act of cruelty. The news spread, stiffening the resolve of those in his path. And in that path stood one final obstacle: the ancient walled port city of Acre. Today we know it as Akko. In modern-day Israel, to Napoleon, Acre was the linchpin of his entire strategy. He expected its capture would take a mere 2 weeks. Failure would be catastrophic, turning his grand invasion into a dead end. The fate of his eastern dream rested on the walls of this ancient fortress. And waiting for him there, having arrived just in time, was the one man he should have least expected to see. Chapter 6. The Siege of Acre, the unmovable object. As Napoleon's army marched on Acre in March of 1799, they were confident. But anchored just offshore were 2 British ships of the line, HMS Tiger and HMS Theseus. In command was Commodore Sir Sidney Smith, sent to the Levant. Smith had arrived just in time to grasp the strategic importance of Acre. He immediately made contact with the city's Ottoman governor, Djezzar Pasha, and put his ships and men at Djezzar's disposal, becoming the heart of the city's defense. And with him was another familiar face, the French royalist engineer who had helped him escape from prison, Antoine de Philippot. The very man who had spirited Smith out of Paris was now here, at the edge of the world, ready to use his engineering genius to thwart Napoleon's conquest. The stage was set for a personal showdown. Napoleon began the siege on March 20th, but he was about to receive a masterclass in unconventional warfare. First, the matter of artillery. Napoleon knew Acre's medieval walls couldn't stand up to his heavy siege cannons. But his siege train was being transported by sea. In a staggering stroke of luck and skill, Smith's squadron intercepted and captured the convoy carrying the bulk of his artillery. In a move of supreme, taunting irony, Smith and Philippot had those very same French cannons mounted on the walls of Acre and turned against their former owners. Second, Smith used his command of the sea to devastating effect. His ships hammered the French siege works, while smaller gunboats enfiladed the French trenches with constant fire, making it nearly impossible for them to prepare their assaults. Third, on the ground, Smith and Philippot transformed the defense. They repaired fortifications, and Smith landed his own sailors and Royal Marines to reinforce the Ottoman garrison. They organized daring raids and dug counter-tunnels to intercept French miners. Finally, there was psychological warfare. Smith was a visible, defiant presence. He reportedly exchanged taunting letters with Napoleon, reminding the general of the poor prisoner in the cell of the Temple prison, who now stood in his way. To the French army, who knew the story of Smith's escape, his very presence was a source of frustration. For 2 long months, the siege ground on into a bloody nightmare. Napoleon's men launched assault after assault, only to be driven back with horrendous casualties. Disease, including the plague, ravaged the French camp. In early May, Napoleon made one last desperate push. His veterans breached the outer walls, but were met by a second line of defenses constructed by Philippot and Djezzar Pasha. As Smith personally led his British sailors, armed with pikes, into the breach, the French assault broke. It was over. On May 20th, 1799, after 62 days, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. He had been defeated. His army limped back toward Egypt, leaving behind thousands of dead and the wreckage of an emperor's dream. Chapter 7. The Aftermath. That man made me miss my destiny. The retreat from Acre was a humiliation. It was arguably the first undeniable strategic defeat of Napoleon's career, a jarring halt to his momentum. He had been stopped not by a coalition army but by a dilapidated fortress, a stubborn governor, and one impossibly vexing British naval officer. The failure at Acre destroyed his eastern dream. The road to Constantinople was closed. Years later, exiled on St. Helena, Napoleon would reflect on the campaign. He reportedly laid the blame squarely on Smith. Had he been able to take Acre, he mused, the face of the world might have changed. I would have made myself Emperor of the East, he imagined, and I would have returned to Paris by way of Constantinople. Whether this grand vision was ever truly possible is highly debatable, but in Napoleon's mind, the man who slammed that door shut was Sidney Smith. It's this belief that is the source of his famous, bitter lament, as reported in memoirs from his exile. That man made me miss my destiny. This fixation stands in contrast to his relationships with more famous rivals. Wellington defeated him decisively, but they met only once. Admiral Nelson shattered his naval power, but their rivalry was one of fleets, not personal duels. Sidney Smith was different. He was a recurring character in the drama of Napoleon's rise. At Toulon, at the dawn of Napoleon's fame, Smith scarred the victory. Then, after being captured, he reappeared like a ghost at Acre to dismantle Napoleon's most cherished ambition. He proved the great Napoleon could be stopped, not just by an army, but by ingenuity and audacity. History has largely relegated Sir Sidney Smith to a footnote. His flamboyant personality and friction with the British Admiralty meant he never reached the same heights of command as Nelson. He died in Paris and is buried there, an interesting end for a man who so vexed France's greatest ruler. But his impact was undeniable. He was the spanner in the works of the Napoleonic machine, an individual who, through sheer force of will, managed to alter the trajectory of a would-be emperor. The story of Sir Sidney Smith is a powerful reminder that history is full of unsung figures whose actions had profound consequences. If you're enjoying this look into the forgotten rivalries that shaped our world, take a moment to subscribe and join us as we uncover more hidden stories from the past. Conclusion. In the grand epic of the Napoleonic Wars, the duel between Napoleon and Sir Sidney Smith was a sideshow. It wasn't Waterloo or Trafalgar, but on a personal level, it was arguably the most frustrating rivalry of Napoleon's career. It was a clash of personalities, the cold strategist versus the flamboyant improviser. At Toulon, Smith announced his presence in Napoleon's life with fire. At Acre, he cemented his role as the great man's personal nemesis, fated to appear at the worst possible time. Napoleon built an empire and remade Europe. He faced down emperors and kings. But as he sat in exile, it was the memory of the defeat at Acre that stung with a unique bitterness. He never forgot the name of the British sea captain who, with a few ships and a crumbling fortress, drew a line in the sand and declared, "You shall not pass." And in that bitter reflection lies the forgotten legacy of Sir Sidney Smith, the one man Napoleon felt he could never truly conquer.